Okay, everyone, welcome to Free School for Farm Workers. Today's session is on farming in an ableist society. So, some quick housekeeping notes are that we have closed captioning enabled, so you can access that through the Zoom platform if you'd like. And in addition to Spanish interpretation, we also have the chat being translated into Spanish by Jeanette. So, very quickly, my co-organizer and I want to introduce ourselves before we get started. My name is Anita. I'm with Not Our Farm, and Not Our Farm is a nonprofit farm worker storytelling and power building project. And our work is national, and I'm based in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And in fact, Not Our Farm is celebrating our 5-year anniversary at the end of this month. And I'll pass it to Sarah.
Thanks, Anita. That is worth celebrating. Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Jane Zugratz, and I work with UW Extension and Fair Share CSA Coalition based in Wisconsin. And a lot of the work that I do is really grounded in building positive and safe labor experiences for folks on diversified vegetable farms. Great to be here.
So before we start, also want to share a little bit about Free School for Farm Workers for folks who this is your first time attending. So Free School is a series we began this year, and it's inspired by the power of community education, and specifically by anarchist free schools that are located all over the world. So Free School is a direct reaction to knowledge hoarding that we so often see and experience as workers on farms. And we also know that amongst us, there's so much knowledge, wisdom, skill, and we really wanted to create a space where we can share that information amongst each other and build connections and community with each other as farm workers. So we try really hard to protect this space, and our free school sessions are reserved for farm workers only and for those who work directly with farm workers. So, because of the power dynamics we know exist on farms, this is not a space for traditional farm owners and operators. And we know that resources exist out there in the world for them too. So all of our free school teaching topics come from needs and requests posed by farm workers like yourselves. So if there's a topic or a question that you want to Skillshare on or have a teach-in hosted about, please let us know. Sarah's going to drop a link to a submission form in the chat, and you can put your ideas in there. So today's session, Farming in an Ableist Society, is one that we've received so many requests on. We've definitely been really waiting to host this teach-in. We're excited to do it. And it's something that I know we grapple with and rage against at Not Our Farm on a regular basis. It's clear from the interest and the registration for this session that a lot of people are navigating this in their lives and on farms where they work or they have worked in the past. This is a topic or a subject that I personally have dealt with my entire career working on farms too. I have countless stories, like I'm sure you all do as well. But one that I want to share here is that early on in my career, I suffered from frostbite in both of my feet working on a farm in Pennsylvania. It's something that I never disclosed to the farm owner, and it's a condition I've been dealing with during winter months since then, and that was 10 years ago. The farm wasn't a space where we were allowed to show weakness. In fact, we were reprimanded if we ever asked for help. Endurance and being seen as the hardest worker was rewarded, and it proved that we were real farmers, quote unquote. I also suffer from impact induced arthritis in my hands from years of banging my knuckles on crates and scraping them. And these two things I share because to me, this displays ableism in farming and also how farming can disable. I want to say that our facilitator today, Kristie, was the first person that I ever talked to about my frostbite, and this was maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And they validated my experience and offered a space for both outrage and mourning in a way that was healing for me and really shifted my mindset around how I was thinking about farming and my role in it. So I'm really excited to welcome Kristie to Free School today for this session. We're so grateful to have their expertise, their compassion, and their perspectives. We have so much to talk about, so I'll leave it at that for now. I'll let them introduce themselves in just a moment. First, I want to pass it to Sarah for a really exciting announcement.
Yeah, thanks, Anita. So we are excited to be doing our first ever Free School for Farm Workers book raffle. So during the break that we'll have coming up a little bit later, we'll randomly select 5 folks who are joining us tonight to receive The Future is Disabled: Prophecies, Love Notes, and Morning Songs by Leah Lakshmi Piepzna Samarsinga. And we will announce those folks who have been selected as we come back from the break. So stay tuned for that. And now I'm going to turn it over to Kristie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kristie. Thank you for being here. I'm honored to be sharing this space with you all. And before we begin, I'd like to talk a little bit about myself. So I do have personal experience with disability. I am disabled, I am autistic, and have ADHD. I also have chronic fatigue, PMDD, and sensory processing challenges. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm passionate about accessible and inclusive nature and food spaces. Let me go to the next slide. Thank you. So my background is in occupational therapy. For those who aren't familiar with the profession, pretty much I'm a healthcare worker, and my job is to help people engage in activities that they want to participate in, but they're struggling to do so. So I either help the person to build skills in order to participate, or I modify the environment or the activities to create a better match. So for example, if I was working with a farmer who struggled with chronic fatigue the way I do, I might work with them to modify their environment on the farm and how they're engaging in farm tasks so that they're better able to do their farm work in a way that honors their body. In addition to being an occupational therapist, I've been doing accessibility consultation work for about 4 to 5 years. I also spent 5 years as a program manager creating inclusive culinary experiences for neurodivergent children to adults in New York City. So pretty much within the last 10 years, I've been dedicating my work to working with the disabled community and focusing on access. And my overall life journey, and what got me into the consultation work is I hope to one day co-design with disabled people an outdoor educational and healing space where disabled people can go and do all the outdoor nature-based activities like farming, but also like making plant medicine in a way that is accessible and inclusive for them. Let me go to the next slide. So I want to just touch a base on my access needs. I'm seeing the chat go off of people are saying things like, that's my dream too. And yes, I love that. We should chat. So for my access needs today, if you have any clarifying questions, so a question where you want me to repeat something or you're not understanding what I'm saying, you can ask those questions at any time. You can unmute yourself or put the question in the, or let me know in the chat. And if you see, if all of you see that I'm not responding to that in the chat, just, unmute yourself for your friend, for your peer here and say, hey, Kristie, we have a clarifying question. Exploratory questions are questions like, I want to learn more about this. I want to connect this to something else. Anything that's going to elaborate conversation, let's save that to the end. We may not have time for Q&A though, but if we did, Q&A will be at the end. Please ask your questions in the chat though, because if there isn't time for Q&A, I will write up responses for you and email everyone the responses to those questions. I do need some additional processing time when answering questions, and there will be a 5-minute break at the halfway mark. Next slide. So please, again, interrupt me for your access needs if they are not being met. I can do tons of things to modify the PowerPoint, like changing font size or color. I can adjust my talking speed. And please show up today whatever way feels good for you. So if you want to shut your camera off or stim or eat, please go ahead and do that. Next slide, please. So on this slide, we have an overview of our presentation. I want to start off by saying that it's overwhelming how many people signed up, and just want to clarify that this is an introduction to ableism in agriculture. So there aren't many facilitated conversations on this topic, and I want to make sure that we are all on the same page with basics. So we will be discussing what does it mean to be disabled, what is ableism, how ableism shows up in farming communities. We will hear from two different people about their farm worker stories. I'll talk about opportunities to create more inclusion and access on farms. I'll also share some things that I can offer to make things hopefully easier for you on your journey with this. And then I'll share some resources later on in the week when the presentation is all set and done. So I also want to mention that there is a trigger warning of a mention of death when talking about how ableism shows up in farming, and that is on slide number 32. And I believe you can see the slide numbers on the bottom right-hand corner, and I will also give you another heads up. So let's go ahead and get started. Yes, thank you for part one. So let's start with, what exactly does it mean to be disabled? You are welcome to share your definition in the chat. Let's go to the next slide. So it might surprise you that there is actually no one set definition of what it means to be disabled. I do have three different definitions here. We have a definition from the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 that says someone is disabled when they have a physical or mental disability which results in a substantial handicap to employment. We have a definition from the Americans with Disability Act that says it's a person who has physical or mental impairments that substantially limits one or more major life activity. And then we have a definition from the CDC that says you're disabled when you have any condition of the body or mind, quote parentheses, impairment, that makes it more difficult for the person with the condition to do certain activities and interact with the world around them. Now, there's two things I want to point out here. The first is I want to point out that in each of these definitions, they are saying that the disability is within you, that it's something within your physical or something that's physical or something that's mental. And that's really interesting because if you're familiar with the social model of disability that says sometimes it's not the person that is disabled, it is the environment that is disabling, that our physical and social environment has barriers that causes disability in an individual. None of these definitions recognize that the environment can be disabling. Another thing to point out is the connection between disability and inability to participate in capitalism. So like in the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, it literally says, right, you have a physical or mental disability that substantially impacts your ability to engage in employment. On the other two definitions, they're using the words like activities, impacting your ability to engage in activities. But if you look up what those activities are, one of those activities that they're still listing is employment. So you begin to see that even when looking at language, there's this connection to value and productivity. So we could go to the next slide. Another thing to remember when talking about definitions is that there is no one definition of disability, and there are many ways of being disabled. You can have a medical diagnosis, you can self-diagnose yourself, you can have absolutely no diagnosis. All of that is valid here. When I talk about disability, I'm also talking about people who are neurodivergent. So those are our autistic friends, our friends who have ADHD, people who have experienced traumatic brain injury. And we're also including people who have mental health conditions. So people who are depressed, have PMDD like myself, people who are bipolar. So disabled captures all of that. Let's go to the next slide. So another basic foundational part of learning about access is understanding how language is really important to the disabled community. And there are two different ways to describing disability or someone who's disabled. The first is using person first language, is when we say this, a person with a disability. Now, there's a whole history as to why this has been the preference. It originally was from this place of respect, being able to see the disabled person underneath the disability, right? Because the disability is seen as separate, something that can be fixed. but this is no longer the preferred language in most disabled communities, especially within the autistic community. So you wouldn't say, I have autism. You would say, I am autistic, or they are autistic. Let's go to the next slide. This is a visual representation of what we're talking about. So we have an individual that has person first on top of their head, and they're holding a blue puzzle piece in their hand to the side. And underneath the puzzle piece, it says person with autism. So when we're thinking about person first language, we are thinking about this puzzle piece or the autism or the disability that's separate from the individual. Let's go to the next slide, please. The opposite of that is identity first language. It's saying disabled person. And when we use identity first, we are saying that the disability is not, it's just as important as any other identity that someone has. It's just as important and cannot be separated the same way we can't separate our race, our gender, our religion, right? These are things that are completely a part of us, and that the disability cannot be quote unquote fixed. That doesn't mean that we can't have management or treatment to make a better quality of life, but we're not necessarily always just thinking about our disability as something that can be taken out of us. Let's go to the next slide, please. So this is just another visual representation of what identity first looks like. There is an individual that has a puzzle piece behind them. The puzzle piece is just as big and tall as they are, and it's just symbolizing that the puzzle piece or the disability or being autistic is completely a part of the person. It cannot be separated. Next slide. So regardless, there's, always going to be an ongoing debate when it comes to language. So you always want to make sure you ask people their preference, especially if you're talking about that person. But generally speaking, my advice is if you are just talking about disability vaguely, or you're talking to a group of people like I am today, use identity first language, which is disabled person, or they are disabled. And that's because there's so much first person accounts and literature out there of people saying like this is their preference. Generally speaking, though, outside of like these conversations, we really don't need to say that someone is disabled or whatever. What we really want to talk about is people's access needs and how we can support them and create an inclusive environment for them. So sometimes if you don't know what language to use, instead of talking about disability, talk about their access needs. So regardless of the ongoing debates with language, there are a few things that we know for sure, which is that euphemisms are harmful. And a euphemism is a word that replaces another word because that word is seen as uncomfortable, socially inappropriate, icky. And the word disabled has been that word. People have gone through all sorts of lengths to not say disabled. They have used words like special needs, differently able, and so many other creative things, all because they don't want to say or have been socially trained not to say disabled. And I'm here to say that disabled and disability is not a bad word. It gives you straightforward information of what's happening. The person is disabled. So if you take away anything, it's try to take euphemisms out of your language and just continue to reclaim the word disabled. Let me go to the next slide. So however you decide to define disability, what language you choose, I want you to at least remember this quote, because this is how we start to change our perspective on what does it mean to be disabled. We change the narrative. And the quote says, "When we speak of disability, we celebrate the brilliance and vitality of a vast community with non-normative bodies and minds, whether the disability is visible or not." And I love this quote because when do we ever talk about disabled people when we're talking about celebration and brilliance, when we're talking about wisdom and value. And I always keep this in mind whenever I'm doing my work because I don't ever want to talk about only barriers when it comes to the disabled community. There's so much that we can learn from disabled people. So if you take away anything, take away this quote and always remember it as you're engaging in this work. So let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so what is ableism? And if you were to Google or any search engine you're using, what is ableism? You'll probably get a response that's one, maybe two sentences long. If we go to the next slide, I am giving you, go down on the slide. I think, sorry, Mia, I think we're on the wrong slide here.
Sorry, Kristie.
Next one?
Okay. Definitions?
No, this should be, it should be the ableism definition slide.
Okay. That is I'm going to go one more.
There you go. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Maybe there was a duplicate. Sorry, my dog is barking in the background. I'm gonna wait for her to chill out. Okay, so like I was saying, I'm giving you a really long definition of ableism because ableism is at the root of all injustices. It is complex, it is tricky, and a one to two sentence definition doesn't capture the complexity. So I'm going to read this long definition by Talila Lewis, and then I'm going to give you the bullet point version of it. So it says, ableism is a system of assigning value to people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, productivity, desirability, intelligence, excellence, and fitness. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in eugenics, anti-Blackness, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. This systemic oppression that leads to people in society determining people's value based on their culture, age, language, appearance, religion, birth or living place, quote unquote, health/wellness, and or their ability to satisfactorily re/produce, quote unquote, excel, and quote unquote, behave. You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. And this is a working definition. Talila Lewis has multiple versions of this definitions that Talila updates throughout the years, just because ableism is tricky, and like all forms of oppression, they look different as society changes. So let's go to the next slide, please. So the main typical ways of this is that ableism assigns values to people's bodies and minds. It is socially constructed. It is rooted in eugenics, anti-Blackness, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. And the most important thing that I think is that you do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. If more people knew that, I think more people would take access work and unpacking ableism a little bit more seriously. So I'm curious to hear what you think about this definition and if it changes your perspective on what ableism actually is. So feel free to share your thoughts in the chat. Let's go to the next slide. So now we're asking the question, how does ableism show up in farming communities? I'm going to give you a few different examples. Let's go to the next slide. So we'll do an overview. So we have this idea that ableism is about assigning value to people's bodies and minds. And if we think about American history, I mean, when has that has always happened, right? So we know that ableism and slavery co-evolved, that Black bodies were treated as tools for labor, that their value was measured by their labor capacity, and a lot of it was agricultural labor. Then we have institutions in the 1800s. And if you're not familiar with institutions, there pretty much were these giant buildings with lots of different rooms where disabled and poor people went to get treatment for their disability, for their illness. A lot of the times they were forced to get treatment and forced to be segregated. People often think of the big buildings when they think of institutions, but there were actually also farm colonies that were functioning in the same way, where people use agriculture labor as a part of their treatment or care, which I think is really ironic given that, a lot of these people were going to get treatment so that they can be productive members of society, which means to work, but yet they were going to these farm colonies and doing work to offset the cost of getting the treatment there. So that's a whole nother story. But we see this idea of people's values, people assigning value to people, and therefore being able to make decisions for them and controlling them. And then we have migrant workers who face exploitation. On one hand, they're valued because society feels it needs the cheap labor, it needs the urgency, it needs the increase of hands. On the other hand, they aren't valued where they are put in demanding conditions and are treated unfairly. So let's go to the next slide. Another way ableism shows up is how farms are physically inaccessible. And I get that land has hills and dips and holes and cracks, and I'm not criticizing the land. What I'm criticizing is that farmers don't always recognize that they are literally shaping the land. They are designers in some way. And they're making these intentional choices on what to do with the land. And a lot of it is about maximizing harvest, which makes sense. But we have spent season after season after season looking at the land and thinking about how it can be productive for harvest, for growing food for other people. But we're not necessarily looking at the land and thinking about how it can be helpful or allow our bodies or other people's bodies and minds engage with the land in an easier or better way. So I like to talk about how I don't often see people think about, especially those who want to be farming for the next 20, 30, 40 years, how is the land you're farming on going to grow with you as you get older, right? As your disability changes, as you go from pre-disabled to disabled. Another way that farms are physically inaccessible, which is coming from an ableist place, is when purchasing farm tools and equipment. We often don't consider that these tools are often used collectively by the farm team, and we purchase tools without asking people about their access needs, their struggles with using the tools, or even considering how the tools impacts our own body. And then the last example I'm giving on this slide is the lack of accommodations or a resistance to accommodations on farms. There is so much value placed on farmers' physical bodies, but there isn't as much space to be able to acknowledge out loud when a body needs something like a break, when a body needs to take a day off, when a body needs to do something different. So even if accommodations are allowed, there's this culture of not wanting to speak up that I often see and have experienced. Let's go to the next slide. Then we also, well, let me take a pause. So a lot of people ask me, how can farming be accessible when it's so labor intensive? And that there's no way of getting around that. And it's a valid question, but making farms accessible does not necessarily mean that there will be no physical labor required. Making farms accessible means disabled people can participate in a farm, and that might mean with some form of assistance or accommodation. So one way ableism shows up is how we talk about physical labor in our hiring practices, like in our job postings. So I have text on the slide. The first part of the text is in red. It's the first section. And I literally went on Indeed.com and looked up a farm job and copy and pasted it. So the job post says that the person has to be able to perform labor-intensive agricultural tasks. And that might seem normal, right? But what makes this ableist is that it's usually all the information that is provided, and that is because the person who is hiring is expecting a non-disabled farm worker. They aren't thinking about how what they consider labor intensive may be different than what someone else consider is labor intensive. This is often how farmers get caught up with working on a farm and they're exhausted because they didn't realize what labor intensive tasks they would actually be doing until it's the middle of the season. So underneath the first text, we have two other small texts, and it's in blue. And I'm providing a different version of how we can make this a little bit more inclusive. So we can say things like candidates should be able to perform the following laborious tasks. Let people know exactly what it is that they are going to be doing. We strive to create an inclusive workplace and welcome candidates who utilize assistive technology, adaptive equipment, ergonomic tools, and/or perform labor tasks with modifications. And a lot of people ask me, well, how do I know if a job is going to be inclusive to me, is going to allow me to do all these things? Wouldn't it be amazing if you found a job that actually listed out, hey, how you do farm work is totally fine. So this is something to keep in mind if when looking at job postings or if you have any control of creating job listings. So to the next page, please. The next slide. So another way that ableism shows up is forgetting that our CSA drop-off locations need to be accessible. There are many drop-off locations that I have seen where there's no accessible parking, where the food boxes are inside a building, that there is only stairs to enter. So people forget about these things. Another way is there's very limited considerations of accessibility and disabled people when expanding or investing in the farm. So when expanding the farm and adding more stuff to it, they're not thinking about accessibility. When they are expanding the services or programs they offer, like apprenticeships or volunteer days, they're not necessarily thinking about how to make it accessible or inclusive. Another thing we've seen, and especially within the last few years where farms have really blown up on social media, is that people aren't following accessibility guidelines for making posts. So they're talking about, hey, come to our farm. We have this amazing farm event for BIPOC people. We're going to chill and hang out and do plant medicine. But they're not going to get people who have access needs on social media if they're not doing basic access guidelines, because those people are not going to find those posts or be able to engage with them. Another way that we see ableism is through workplace favoritism. So the quote unquote hardest worker, the one who is the most social, the one who takes on the most cognitively demanding tasks, or the people who are often treated as favorites or are promoted, not so much the people who maybe need help or a little bit more introverted. Let's go to the next slide. So I have two more slides of examples for you. So this is another job posting example that shows how we can take something that's coming from an ableist place and make it more inclusive. So in the job posting, it said the person has to have excellent interpersonal communication skills and energy for engaging with other people. What in the world is excellent interpersonal communication skills? Again, we have this non-disabled neurotypical standard here as to what is excellent. And then energy for engaging with other people, what does that mean? It's giving like to me, it sounds like they're looking for someone who's extroverted, who's likable, someone who is able to meet certain standards socially that they aren't exactly stating here. Underneath that, I have a version that's a little bit more inclusive, and it says, the person should be committed to communicating with the team with a focus on effective interaction. We value and encourage all individuals to bring their unique communication approaches and adapt as needed to foster collaboration. So we're being very direct and we're saying, come as you are. Let's go to the next slide. This is my last slide of examples of how ableism shows up. So I'm really taken back by the complete disregard that farms have for COVID safety, especially farms that dare talk about food justice and supporting Black and Brown people. This is where I'm going to mention death in relation to COVID. So trigger warning here. So COVID has killed millions of people and disabled millions more. And for an industry in which your body and mind is needed, you would think there would be more care to protect each other. And if you're able to ignore COVID, then what you have is denial privilege. And like any other person who has privilege, whether it's white privilege, male privilege, etc., it's your responsibility to reflect on how your actions impact those around you and contributes to other people's oppression. So when farms don't have COVID precautions, whether it's precautions between workers or precautions for events that they host, what are they saying? Are they saying that farmers don't get sick, that farmers don't need to protect their health, that farmers don't care about disabled people? You know, no one wants to talk about COVID, but we can't make farms more accessible if we continue to try to live in dystopia. So that is my insert here, COVID's still important part that I really wanted to express. Let's go to the next slide. So here I have a visual. I have two circles and they're overlapping. And the left circle says ableist farming communities. The right circle says disabled farmers, and the overlapping part says survival. There is an arrow pointing down from the word survival, and I have the words accommodations, masking, burnout, quit/avoid. And there is an arrow that's pointing from masking, burnout, quit/avoid back to the ableist farming communities circle. So what this visual is saying is that both ableist farming communities and disabled farmers are trying to survive. Farms need to financially survive, and they feel threatened when people on their team are disabled or have access needs. Excuse me. Disabled farmers are trying to survive a capitalistic society as well by working a job either they were only able to get, that was available, or it happens to be a job that they love. And as a result, because of these two things clashing for survival, there are four basic or general outcomes of this. The first is accommodations. Accommodations are provided to disabled farmers, which allows them to complete their job. We'll talk about accommodations in a bit. The next is masking. So masking is a term used to describe how people would hide traits about themselves that might be considered negative. So for neurodivergent people, they often mask and engage in they often mask by engaging in social activities that are expected. So I'm a neurodivergent person. If I took off my mask, my neurodivergent mask, I probably would never tell you good morning, and I probably won't ask you what your weekend was like if I barely knew you at work, but I will be totally open to having a deep conversation about the meaning of life. That's not socially appropriate, right? You go into work in the office, or if you work in an office, if you work in a farm, you go into work in the farm, and people are like, the weather, the weekend. These are social pleasantries. And people mask in order to get along with each other. The next is burnout, which is usually how most farmers survive the season. They just keep working and working until they collapse in the beginning of winter or when their work with the farm is done. And then the last option is to quit the job or to avoid farming next time. Masking burnout, quitting, and avoiding is going to continue to contribute to having farms continue their ableist practices. So let's go to the next slide. Thank you. So the big question is, who is responsible for making farms more accessible and inclusive? And the reality is it's everyone's responsibility. We have to shift our perspective on seeing access as something that is difficult or confusing and shift it to seeing access as community care and love. And therefore, if your being is rooted in community care and love, it should be your responsibility. How you are responsible, though, is up to you. And it's really hard to do it, though, right? Because speaking up can be seen as causing tension in the workplace, especially when someone speaks up about an access issue and then suddenly everyone else on the team has the access issue and no one was saying anything before. There's also limited resources on accessibility within farming communities. And then there's this overall sense of urgency and exhaustion that farmers experience that prevents them from initiating and sustaining change. So if you go to the next slide, I want to share a quote with you on how we should approach this, given that access work is love, right? But having to do it in an industry where so much of it is rooted in ableism, it can be challenging. So this quote is by Judith Heumann, who was an American disability rights activist, and it says, "Change never happens at the pace we think it should. It happens over years of people joining together, strategizing, sharing, and pulling all the levers they possibly can. Gradually, excruciatingly slow, things start to happen, and then suddenly, seemingly out of the blue, something will tip." So I want you to keep that in mind as we do this work. And go to the next slide. So we'll take our 5-minute break here, and then we'll continue when we come back. I completely did not know what time I paused, so I'm thinking it's 5 minutes now.
I have it. I'm using my stopwatch. We're at 3 minutes, 3.5 minutes in. So we still have a minute and a half if we need. All right, everybody, welcome back from the break. That was a quick 5 minutes, but I hope it was somewhat restorative. Before Kristie takes us into our next session, I'm going to put these three folks who were selected for The Future is Disabled in the chat here, and I'll read them off. So we have Karima N, Liana S, and Foster G. I will double check that you all are still on the call, but you were a few minutes ago. And then Anita and I will follow up with y'all to get the information that we need to make sure we get these books to you. So thanks for joining. And Kristie, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. All right, so I'm very excited for our next part, which is farm worker stories. We're going to listen to two different people, Mercedes first, and then Sebastian. So Mercedes, whenever you're ready, please go ahead and share your story.
Hello. Thank you, Kristie, for sharing your slides. Accessibility in farm work is like such a complex thing that it feels a little bit overwhelming to approach it. But I don't know. I felt like there's a lot of positivity in what you shared. So that felt really nice. My name is Mercedes Santiago. I'm sorry. I just got my wisdom tooth removed, so I'm a little bit spacey still. Um, but I live in the Great Plains. I'm a farm worker. I'm an ecologist. I've done a lot of work on both farms and in labs. And I've worked in academia. I've worked in agriculture. I've worked in nonprofits. So like accessibility shows up so differently in those spaces. Um, my experience is I am a Puerto Rican woman. My father came here when he was 19. He joined the military, like so many young Puerto Ricans do. Um, and he comes from a long line of farm workers, of agriculturalists on the island. People who are familiar with Puerto Rican culture might be familiar with jivaros. Those are our people, the mountain like peasant farmers. So our family's been farming for a long time, and he said, it skipped a couple of generations because he grew up on his grandparents' farm and he realized like, oh, this is hard. And he didn't want to do it. So it's not for everybody, but my sibling and I, we both have that in us, like that urge, that desire to be on the land. And it's been hard for both of us. I won't speak for them, but they have their own issues with disability and chronic pain specifically. But we both have had to navigate this in agriculture. And for me, my experience has been of chronic illness, and I was born with really severe congenital hypothyroidism. So I don't have a thyroid gland. It doesn't produce any hormones. So like I take a supplement for that. It's not the same as having a functioning thyroid gland. I am really neurodivergent, so I have ADHD. I, rolled with a real neurodivergent crew growing up. My best friend of 15 years received her autism diagnosis as an adult about 3 years ago. And that was really profound for her. And not super surprising for me. I was like, this is why I love you. Uh, so um, I think that a lot of my experiences have been more with dealing with like chronic fatigue and the burnout, and it's sort of feeling like I'm not robust enough to do the work that I want to do, that I'm not enough to like be in the world the way that I want to be. And that has been like really pervasive in my life. I also have come from a background of like really profound family trauma. So like some of my family members have been incarcerated multiple times. I have PTSD, and that contributes to a lot of the experiences with accessibility that I have. And all of that combined, like I still love farm working and I love agriculture. And so I've learned that I can't not do this work. And so trying to find ways to exist in this space, um, have, it's been a part of my journey just because I don't want to stop. Um, so my experiences on farms, like I worked on several different farms, and some of the farms I worked at were very like the the human body is viewed as expendable. It's just a tool. Like you just are there to get the job done. And you know, that is difficult. That's a difficult situation to be in. There can be a lot of power abuses. I was on farms that I lived on, and that can be a really, if that's not approached ethically, that can lead to some really problematic power dynamics, especially in combination with ableism. Um, I think I had a farmer once tell me, I told her, like, I'm feeling overwhelmed, like I can't do all of this. And her response was like, well, you should feel like you're drowning. And if you don't feel like you can handle it, then you shouldn't be in agriculture. And that was really heartbreaking. That was a really low moment for me. But I'm glad I didn't give up, because just a year later, I found a farm that really changed my outlook on what was possible. Um, and so I farmed in Lawrence, Kansas for a while. It's like Lawrence, Kansas is where all like the weirdos and hippies in Kansas end up for at least a little while. So I farmed there for about 3 years, and the woman I worked for, I don't think she would consider herself disabled by any means. But she did live with chronic pain, and like that was part of her experience, and that really informed her experience as a boss, as like a farm owner. Um, and she was really human centered. She like had a lot of consideration of that there were like human beings working for her, and that we had needs. And so one of the things that she did that I was really impressed by was she wouldn't make us work more than 30 hours a week. If we wanted to do market, that would sometimes put us over 30 hours a week, but market is, for anyone who's done it, can be really enjoyable, in small doses. So, she had this sort of like pro labor approach. That was like a big shift for me in realizing that it would be possible for me to like continue, and that I could exist in that space. I could show up and I could farm and I could be enough. I worked with people there who had different disabilities too. So like one of my coworkers, she had really chronic pain. She had a condition, I can't remember what it's called, but chronic pain was a big part of it, and she had to miss work a lot. And so like being adaptable and being flexible to change, it can be a strength for a farm owner. Just like sometimes you don't make the goal and the world continues. In the same vein, like farming was very difficult to continue in because of the institutional issues in farming. There's not like a lot of support for farm workers. So like things that I wasn't offered, and I don't think would have been like financially possible, is like paid sick time. I don't know that that was like a legitimate possibility for the scale we were working at. And the lack of like employer offered healthcare, and the lack of sick time for someone who has chronic illness is like can feel really insurmountable. And so I did pivot after several years of farming. It did become too much, and like burnout was like, I farmed through COVID. I think that's a big part of it, is I farmed in 2019, 2020, 2021. I'd been farming for years before that. And after 2021, I was like, I have to make a change, because like what just happened, it was it yeah, it was really, COVID changed a lot of things. And I think people who had to work and farm through that, it was kind of a disabling event. Like the burnout was so profound. I know a lot of people who had to stop farming at that time. Um, I pivoted, and I sort of ended up in a nonprofit where like for the first time I have access to like, we have to have accessibility with ADA. So like I have access to ADA accommodations and paid sick time and paid, like I have good health insurance that I can rely on, that I don't have to like worry about what the marketplace is going to be like from year to year or if I'll be able to afford it. And that's been really liberating in its own way of just like not having to worry about how am I going to survive. I think there's a difference in the workplaces. Like some things are accommodated better on farms than in like a more business environment. I know a lot of like really neurodivergent people who thrived on farms because um, it's not as socially demanding, you know, like you can work alone a lot. Just being able to like be in the field and be separate and like be in nature, be around animals, that is like really healing for a lot of I think especially people like on the autism spectrum and with ADHD. And like farming can be medicine for that. But in other ways, like for physical disabilities or like physical limitations, farming can also be like a huge access issue, especially like traditional monocropping row agriculture. Like physically, we'd have set up those environments. Like it would be very difficult for a person in a wheelchair to get down a monocropped row and like harvest things by hand. I think it was possible, but we haven't designed those environments that way. And none of the farms I worked on had been designed with the idea of someone with physical limitations in mind. But that being said, even like the farm I worked at, the last farm, we did work with people who had very different bodies. And some of our collaborators in the CSA like have very different mobility needs, and we found ways to work with them. And so if you want to bring people in, like it's definitely possible. I don't know if I've taken 10 minutes, but that's kind of my story and my experience.
Thank you so much for sharing, Mercedes. You said so many things that I resonated with. And I really appreciate you elaborating on what your experiences have been like and what you've seen in the field. So thank you. We have Sebastian, who's going to share their story next.
Hi, can you guys hear me? Sorry about that. So my name is Sebastian Hassel. I currently reside in Middleton, Wisconsin, which is just outside of Madison. I'm originally from the great or not so great, depending on how you feel about it, state of Alabama, uh, where I spent a lot of my youth doing agricultural work, mostly for the sake of sustenance. Picking on halves and things like that. And more recently, I started to farm in Wisconsin, out in Black Earth on Firm Footing Farm, which is a sort of collaborative incubator farm. And also recently worked at a nonprofit organic vegetable farm as the excuse me assistant manager. Until for physical capacity and financial reasons, I had to pivot a little bit. But I do still currently farm out in Black Earth. Uh, I'm sorry, I know it seems like I'm check boxing, but I'm coming at this from the standpoint of, so I am diabetic, I am neurodivergent, I have major depressive disorder, and I have some sensory and mobility issues. And so what I found was that there's a pretty stark contrast between the way I'm able to farm in Black Earth, which isn't a job, but it's also like growing a farming enterprise, versus a production farm where, you know, you gotta uh, be on point to meet the goals and demands and things like that. And so one of the things that I noticed is that as a person who's neurodivergent, and who has other invisible disabilities, um, it was kind of difficult to convey both from an internalized ableism perspective and from a, well, you don't look like there's anything wrong with you perspective. Things like not being able to get down on the ground to do the reading task, or to put things in holes, or not being able to move as quickly on task as crew members. I even had a coworker who had narcolepsy, and an issue that he ran into was he was a solid worker. I mean, as one of the management team, I was very happy that he was on staff, because he was able to crank out, and when he showed up, he got work done. But there were times when he needed to go to sleep, right? And then just not really having that flexibility of knowing that he couldn't just say, I'm going to be asleep for 30 minutes and I'm going to get back up and be able to jump right back in. It was more of I'm going to go to sleep, and whenever I wake up, that's when I'll be able to wake up. I'm happy to work after that. But that led to him eventually being let go, which is, of course, unfortunate. Because at that level, even at a progressive nonprofit, it there wasn't the know-how of how to navigate that and still, meet the goals. Not that the goals should have gone before him as a human being, right? Um, but that's the rationale behind that. And for myself, like I said, doing the protection farm thing, I loved it, but I also hated it because I was burned out very quickly, much to Mercedes's point. We had 3 paid days off. There was no sick time. There were no benefits. So I sustained a couple of injuries throughout the season, and there was no such thing as, I couldn't afford to use paid days off. So, working through those injuries when I shouldn't have, led to some longer term mobility issues that I didn't get resolved until the next year, right? And so I walked away I said, production farming for somebody else, not for me. Can't do it, just because, doctors cost money, and the health issues that I had going into farming, the stuff above and beyond that, you know, uh, just wasn't worth it for me. Um, that's not to say that, you know, it's worth it for anybody, right? But not being able to pay my share of the bills, right? At home kind of took precedence. And so now, where I'm currently growing, it's an interesting experiment in that um, we're managing our business model as far as like farm workers on the land, and in collaboration with people on the farm. It's like managing our expectations, right? So the owners are willing to turn on the water, and say, okay, we'll watch the irrigation, or if you can't make it out here, it's fine. We'll do the couple of tasks. So like finding that balance, right? Of, hey, I'm in a situation with my mental health where I can't get out of the bed today, so I'll see you tomorrow, right? Has really sort of put front and center, for me, the need to um, just advocate for ourselves as people who are working the land, who are on the front lines, and given that pushback. I gave a few. I gave some feedback, right? That wasn't, it wasn't the best received, right? They weren't happy to hear it. But one of the things of like being that person who was able to stand in the gap and say, hey, dude's a good worker. He can't control what his body can and can't do. Or hey, we should be making a livable wage because people, are not everybody is here because they just want to be here. People are here because they have bills to pay and they need to be able to take care of themselves, right? Um, and I guess the other thing is just the whole like, I wish that there were more opportunities on production farms, for feedback to be taken seriously. Because what I found too is that a lot of time it's like, oh, we care about you and we want to hear your feedback. But then when the feedback is, we need more flexibility, the go-to in my experience tends to be, well, we got to be profitable. We got to make this money. But it's like, at what cost? You know, are we seeking to make profits? At what cost are we seeking to um, meet these deadlines? And if the case is downsizing labor and relying on volunteers, you know, um, you know, so just from my perspective, it's well, shame on you, right? For not being willing to pay people or to get creative or do the things that are necessary to be able to pay people a living wage, or and find a way to get benefits. So I think that it's a conversation that needs to go deeper than the few seconds that we give it in those one-to-one situations. And I really hope that even the feedback that we're giving right now, hopefully at some point in the context of farm owners and folks who run the show and handle the purse strings, will be able to kind of sit and like brainstorm and not take no for an answer from themselves. And I encourage everyone on this call, if you're in a situation where you need to advocate for yourself, do it, and rally your coworkers together too, to have some difficult conversations with the folks, in good faith, with the folks that you're working for and working with, and hopefully we can see some change. So that's me. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. I really appreciate you talking about the importance of advocating for yourself. I do touch upon that a little bit, but also bringing up how advocating can be quite different and difficult for people who have invisible disabilities. So disabilities that you don't automatically see when someone is near you. That's also another great conversation of like, how do you constantly have to advocate for yourself when you have an invisible disability? How do you advocate for yourself when you have a visible disability, when people assume what it is that you need? So you mentioned a lot of great gems and I appreciate it. Okay, so let's go back to our presentation. We are at part 3. Want to just make a note of time. I think we should be good to end at the time that we're set for, but we also have 10 extra minutes after the hour, just in case we don't have any material to cover. And then, of course, you'll get the recording. So for part 3, we're going to go into the question, where are there opportunities to create more inclusion and access on farms? And I'm very sorry to disappoint you, but there is no checklist for this. Even if there was a checklist, it wouldn't be perfect because so much of access is context dependent. So the suggestions I'm providing is a very beginner start and aim to support a strong foundation in understanding access and disability. But it's not going to go into the weeds. I got a lot of questions from the registration form where people really want specific answers. And I wrote up responses to those questions, and I will share those responses to you in the resource document. But a lot of my responses is, well, I need more information. I need the context. So what we have to do is learn how to be flexible and creative. So let's go to the next slide. So, like I said before, it's everyone's responsibility to embrace access and inclusion from a place of community care and love. So the work does start with us. And we start applying pressure to farming communities from all sides. And that means that we are going to work to embrace disability justice, which I will talk about in just a second. We're also going to apply pressure by having such a deep and great understanding of our own access needs, to the point where if anyone asks us, how can I help, or what it is that you need, we're able to respond immediately. We're going to normalize talking about disability and accessibility in farm spaces, and then we're going to try to organize. And the reality is that we can want farm owners and managers to lead and sustain change, but we can't expect it. We might want to work in a place that's inclusive but we have to recognize that we are fighting in an industry that has been built through ableism. And the change is going to start with the people who are most impacted, which is us. So let's go to the next slide. So disability justice, everyone should become obsessed with it. It's the answer to all of our problems. It is a movement and a framework that started in 2005 by a few different disabled queer activists. And they created disability justice because they wanted to create a more equitable world that was less ableist. They recognized that even though we had the disability rights movements in the United States, which led to the Americans with Disability Act, we're still not there yet. The ADA is not intersectional. It mostly talks about people with mobility disabilities. The disability rights movement really focused on access, which is important, but it's not just access that we want. We want disabled people to also be in equitable positions of power. We want them to be leaders. And in general, the disability justice movement recognizes that we are not going to get rid of ableism by having the government create an accessible world, right? Nothing's going to change if we're depending on the government to take care of ableism. Change happens with the people. So let's go to the next slide. And disability justice believes that all bodies are unique and essential, that we all have strengths and needs that must be met, that we are powerful not despite the complexities of our bodies, but because of them. And all bodies are confined by ability, race, gender, etc. And we cannot separate these things. So my question for you is, if you think about yourself, right, do you believe that your body is unique and essential, that your body has needs that it must be met? And if you feel like you don't, what would it take for you to believe that? So let's go to the next slide. So understanding your access needs is really important because we have to be able to advocate for ourselves. And if you're disabled, you probably have access needs. And an access need is anything that allows you to participate in an activity or environment. And I'm going to add to that definition. And I'm going to say that an access needs allows you to participate comfortably with purpose and with minimal effort. And I'm going to give you a non-farming example of this. So let's say you're in a classroom and you're having trouble listening to your teacher and taking notes at the same time. Using a note taker isn't going to make the class less difficult. It just means that you can participate as being a student in a way that's comfortable with purpose and minimal effort. That's what we want to strive for when it comes to having our access needs met when working on the farm. So we have access needs, then the accommodations are what fulfill those access needs. So my access need is to have frequent breaks. The accommodation is the farm manager saying, go ahead and take those frequent breaks. Let's go to the next slide. And one way to practice understanding your access needs is to write them down if that method feels good for you. And a way to do this is by writing an access writer. An access writer is a document that outlines your access needs in order to perform a job. It's a little bit more thorough than just writing down bullet points. It's pretty much like a letter saying, this is who I am, and if you want me to work here, this is what I need. And it's something that you can share with your employer at any point of your employment, but it can also be used as just as a self-exploration tool, to kind of think through the tasks that you experience on the farm and come up with your own accommodations. So let's go to the next slide. So here is two examples of what I have on my access rider that I give to people when they hire me. I have a physical example and a cognitive example. So I say, I require frequent breaks that allow me to physically disengage from the task at hand. Typically, I need a 15-minute break for every 45 minutes to an hour of work. I require a quiet space where I can be alone during my break. I need directions in clear written form with information about which tasks need to be prioritized. These directions can be texted to me during the workday, or I can jot them down on my own. So I will literally say, this is what you need to read before we work together. And I would love for you all to try out writing an access writer if that feels doable for you right now. We don't have too much time, so maybe what we can do is just spend 1 or 2 minutes, whatever pops up into your mind. So oh, I'm sorry, let's go to the next slide. Yes. So what I would like is I want you to get into the headspace where you imagine that your employer sees you as someone that is unique and essential, that you're not going anywhere just because you have access needs. They're not going to fire you. That they recognize that the needs that you have must be met, that they understand that you are powerful because of the complexities of your body and your mind. And they also understand that everything about you is important, coming from your disability, your race, your gender, whatever it is. And I want you to just take a minute to write down one thing that will allow you to perform your farm job in a way that's comfortable, with purpose, and with minimal effort. And you're welcome to share that in the chat if you like. So we'll just take 1 minute. Okay, let's come back. I'm sorry there's not enough time, but you're welcome to revisit this activity at a later time. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so to further understand yourself, I suggest exploring your access needs that we just talked about. Take more time to engage in that activity, share it with people you feel safe with, see what they think about it, and also to explore your internalized ableism. Internalized ableism are the negative beliefs that we have about our own disabilities or our own limitations. And exploring them means being gentle with ourselves and saying, hey, I wonder where that's coming from. And what can I do to hold space for that? And what can I do to kind of shift what I'm thinking about right now? Learning from other disabled people is a great way to understand your access needs. However you learn from people, whether it's through social media or purchasing the books that they write or reading the articles that they write, just reach out and follow as many disabled people as possible, even disabled people who are really different from you. It has been the greatest learning tool for myself. I also encourage you to explore learning from anti-ableist sources. So just because, for example, the field of psychiatry is can be helpful to people who have mental health conditions, doesn't mean that psychiatry is inherently anti-ableist. So in the resource document that I'm sharing with you at a later date, I'll have some places for you to learn about different disabilities that are less ableist than others. I also suggest, like we just did right now, some of the people shared in the comments some of their access needs based on that 1-minute breakout activity, but practice communicating your access needs in safer spaces, right? If you feel like your job is not the safest space, what is a safer space? Maybe it's with a friend or your partner, and practice saying something about what you need that maybe you would have ignored or beaten around the bush to say. So something that I've had to practice for years now is saying, I would be able to fully enjoy this hangout more if we both took a COVID test beforehand. That's really uncomfortable and vulnerable for me to say, but I'm practicing my access needs and I'm advocating for myself. Let's go to the next slide. We're almost done. We have about 3 more slides. We need to normalize talking about disability and accessibility. And again, sometimes talking about the things, the isms, racism, ableism, sexism can put us in a hot spot at work, can jeopardize our stability in the workplace. I really suggest that white, non-disabled, and neurotypical people should utilize their privilege and speak up about disability and accessibility first. If you are that person or you have someone that you're working with who is that person, they're going to be in a safer position to talk about things that can rub managers the wrong way. And it's just a way to be an ally. I also suggest strategically speaking up in safer spaces. So there are tons of farm conferences where people get really excited to talk about all the things that, they love talking about things that are hard to implement at conferences. We can talk about disability there. There's nothing wrong with commenting on people's social media posts and asking questions like, hey, what are your accessibility standards on the farm? What are your COVID precautions? You can send inquiry emails. The more that we talk about it casually, the more conversations and change that's going to happen. Let's go to the next slide. So, and then organize. I'm not going to elaborate on this because organizing is a huge, huge topic. And we are really at the beginning of talking about ableism in the farming community. So we need to start talking about it out loud to each other. There were over 300 people that signed up for this presentation. That's 299 people for you to engage with. We need to share our experiences like we did today. And I know I've learned so much. And we need to identify where our learning gaps are. And then once you have your people, right, and you've talked about what's needed in your communities, get as local as you can, then identify what are specific intangible steps that would make your farming community more accessible. That could be anything from maybe you share resources with other farmers that are local to you, or maybe you all apply for a grant to start an adaptive farm tool library, figuring out where to start locally before we take on things nationally. Let's go to the last slide. So I want to be a resource to you all. If you feel that my approach feels good and makes sense to you, I can offer a few things. You're welcome to email me anytime if you would like to have a one-to-one chat. I am a consultant, so if you want to see what it's like to work with a consultant, I'm also an occupational therapist and have a healthcare background. So if you want to see what it's like to talk to someone that can problem solve with you, email me and we can set up a free 45-minute chat. I also have a few different free things for people. I have a Patreon that's starting in January with a free tier. I have a free newsletter that's very, very inconsistent. I'll send you a free resource document. I also started a Facebook group called Disabled and Neurodivergent Land Caretakers, which will be linked in the resource document. you're all the first people to have the link to it, so there's no one else on it, but we can start having these conversations together there. And I'm in the works of creating a COVID conscious farm directory so that all my COVID conscious friends are able to figure out what other farms are practicing COVID safety. So that is the end of our presentation. And I think, Anita, you're going to talk a little bit more about what's upcoming, right?
Yeah, totally. So, well, first of all, thank you so much, Kristie, for taking us through, this discussion around ableism and access and accommodations on farms. So so powerful. Definitely taking those steps forward that you mentioned that we can all do. We hope for everyone here, we really hope that this is the first of many conversations with Kristie through Free School, and we're really looking forward to welcoming them back soon for more discussion with us all. Thank you to Mercedes and Sebastian for sharing your experiences with us. There's so much we can learn from what you shared, and I know that there's deep resonance amongst the group from all of us for what you've endured and also the hopeful futures that you shared with us. Thank you so much to our Spanish interpretation and translation team, Bruje and Jeanette, for your work today. And thank you all for everyone who came today, and the folks who are going to be watching this later as a recording. We're grateful to be able to gather like this at Free School, and we really deeply appreciate all of your participation. We have a short session evaluation that Sarah's going to drop in the chat. Please take a moment whenever you have time to complete it if you'd like. It really helps us to continue building Free School to, be the best that it can be. And then lastly, on this slide, you can see we have some upcoming winter and spring sessions coming up. So January 28th, we have a session with Labor Movement about safe movement on farms. In March, we have a session on seed saving, and in May, pregnancy and farm work. So those two dates are to be decided in the future. So stay tuned for more information on that. And then finally, we're going to be sending out the recording of tonight's event to everyone who registered, including the resources that Kristie is so generously offering with us. So with that, thank you all so much, and have a wonderful night.